You're listening to This is Yoga Therapy. I'm your host, Michelle Lawrence, and I've had the opportunity to interview many of those who are making a difference at the intersections of yoga and health. And I'm here to share with you their stories and conversations. Thanks for listening. In today's episode, I interviewed Susi Amendola. Susi Amendola, author of The Centered Heart, Evidence-Based Mind-Body Practices to Stress Less and Improve Cardiac Health, is an internationally certified yoga therapist who brings over 40 years of experience utilizing yoga and lifestyle practices to help others heal. In 1983, she founded Yoga Now in Omaha, Nebraska, where she currently teaches classes and directs the annual 200-hour yoga certification program. Susi has developed yoga-based stress management programs for schools, businesses, and hospitals throughout the country. Presently, Susi is a national senior trainer of stress management for the prestigious Ornish Lifestyle Medicine Program for reversing heart disease. The program includes yoga as part of a multidimensional approach to healing and is covered by Medicare under the guidelines of intensive cardiac rehab. Susi has contributed over 150 articles to Ornish Living magazine, an online publication to support those who are making lifestyle changes to improve their health and well-being, with an audience of over 1 million subscribers. With her expertise in both the ancient practices of yoga and the medical world, Susi's teachings and classes are unlike anything else you will find. Her teaching style is heart-centered, nurturing, practical, and empowering. I love all those qualities, by the way. And she continues to practice, teach, and inspire others to listen deeply to the healer within. And we're going to speak about her work and her Centered Heart book and more on the podcast today. It's such a pleasure to have you here, Susi.
Michelle, thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, let's just have you start by sharing a little bit more about your background. You've been at this for a while, and it would really be great to hear how you first got on this path.
Well, when I was young, when I was 15 years old, I suffered from a kind of crippling anxiety. I had gone to a party and smoked weed, and for some reason, I just came unglued. And it wasn't the kind of unglued that like somebody might normally have when they do some kind of drug. It was where my whole nervous system just kind of shut down, and I wasn't able to go to work. I wasn't able to go to school. I couldn't sleep at night. I had a hard time getting up in the morning. It was just dreadful. I couldn't drive a car. And it went on for months and months and months. And then it became years of sort of the residual effects of that. So it was at a time, it sort of triggered this really crippling anxiety. And it was at a time when anxiety wasn't really talked about. So it was back in the 70s, the late 70s. And so mental health treatments were really unrefined. I remember when I was in high school, I had a friend whose mother would just sit and stare at the walls, and she had had shock treatments for her anxiety. So it was at a time when I felt like afraid to come forward and say what was happening with me because I didn't want to end up in some kind of a mental institution or undergoing some kind of shock therapy. So I kept it to myself, and I really suffered for a very long time. And I really hid it, and I hid it fairly well. But my mom knew that I was suffering. And at one point, she just invited me to go to a yoga class. And she had, my mom was someone who had 5 kids in 6 years. And so she was tremendously stressed.
Any twins in there?
There's 2 Irish twins. I'm Irish twins with both my brother and my sister. So we were just all smushed together. We were all in high school at the same time. So it was a time when my mom really needed outside help. And so she had found a yoga class at a local gym. And then that led her to this ashram, which was in an area outside of Chicago in a little area called Glenview, Illinois. And there was a Swami there. And she said, "Hey, come to class with me." And I said, "Okay." So when I met him, it was like my heart just filled with hope. And I took several classes. And for the very first time, I felt relief from my anxiety. And it had been going on that whole year. So at some point later on, he invited me to move to the ashram that they were opening in Pennsylvania. So this was a couple years went by. I went to classes there. And then later I moved to Pennsylvania and lived there in the ashram for about 5 years. And I was practicing yoga and meditation every day. And I actually got married and had a child. And I ran the vegetarian kitchen, the yogic kitchen, which was kind of an Ayurvedic kitchen. And then I worked with children in the school. So it was really just the perfect place for me. The food, the community, all of the practices, being in nature, because it was in this beautiful old seminary. So it was in nature. So it was incredibly healing. And I felt like I made a lot of progress being there. But at one point, we got wind of sexual misconduct by the Swami, and it was just devastating. So, with our young daughter in tow, my husband and I moved to Omaha, where he was from, and I opened a yoga center there. So, it's really been like one of the longest running yoga centers in the Midwest. I think we opened in 1983. Yeah.
Such a cool story. Of course, there's suffering in there too, but really sort of an amazing intervention there that your mom brought you to that first yoga class, and it really transformed your life in so many ways, it sounds like. And I'm curious how it kind of went from there into yoga therapy. Maybe it was just a natural progression for you, but I'd love to hear about yoga therapy and then also how you got involved in the Dean Ornish program.
Well, thanks for asking that. They're sort of the same, in some ways, the same thing. So I had this yoga center since 1983, and I started training teachers because I needed people to teach. And in 1993, I was approached by a hospital in Omaha, Nebraska. They were going to begin a lifestyle heart trial with Mutual of Omaha, which is an insurance company, and with Dean Ornish. And they wanted to see if his initial studies using lifestyle changes to reverse heart disease could translate to a bigger population. So they called me. They were looking for someone who could teach postures and breathing and relaxation and meditation. And it was almost like they had written a job description for me. And there were a couple of our yoga centers in Omaha, or yoga teachers, but they weren't focused on those aspects of yoga. I was really the only sort of ashram style yoga person around. So they really did need me. There was an Iyengar teacher. In those days, Iyengar didn't teach relaxation. They didn't teach meditation. They taught postures. So it really was a job description for me. But what happened, I wasn't really interested in working for a hospital because I had felt so let down by the medical world in so many ways. I didn't know who he was and I didn't know it would be a match. So I just said no right off the bat. And then they, of course, circled around because they needed me. And it was kind of a funny thing that happened. They offered me $7 an hour. And at the time, I was kind of living on food stamps because I had this yoga center and a young baby and not a lot of work experience except yoga. And so they said $7 an hour. And I said, absolutely not. And they said, well, what would it take for you to work for us? And I said, well, $75 an hour. I mean, that was outrageous then. And they said, okay. And I went, what? Okay. It was kind of like this weird, like I felt like, oh no, now I have to do it. And actually, another thing happened where I just said, I just can't work in a hospital. I mean, I just spent my, 5 years in a yoga ashram. They had Nishchala Devi call me, and she had been working with Dean Ornish in San Francisco doing some retreats, a retreat model of his program. And so she said, I said to her, yeah, I'm like from a yoga center. I don't think I can do this. And she said, well, I was a Swami at Integral Yoga. And as soon as she said that, I was like, oh, he's like really dedicated to this kind of practice. And so I said, yes, those two things together. I was like, oh yeah, I'm definitely doing that.
Oh, that's so wonderful. When was that?
That was in 1993. So I had been at my own center for about just under 10 years. And so I was kind of dug into my life there. And so it was really kind of early in the world of yoga as well. So it was sort of when yoga started moving towards a little more of the sort of hot yoga, and Bikram yoga and power yoga was sort of starting in that time period. And it was also at a time when yoga therapy wasn't a thing. In fact, Yoga Alliance wasn't even together at that time. And at one point during our work with Ornish, we wanted to get Medicare coverage. And they said, well, you can't get coverage unless there's some kind of certifying body. Well, Yoga Alliance was in kind of its early stages. So we kind of hooked onto that and said, okay, we'll make sure that our teachers go through a Yoga Alliance certification. But the downside of that was that we had some yoga teachers that had 30 years of experience who wanted nothing to do with Yoga Alliance, so they quit. So then we ended up with these sort of 2-year, fresh out of the 200-hour training teachers to come into this very sort of big hospital program. So it was a little bit challenging in those early days.
And are you still involved in the Dean Ornish program today?
I am. In fact, just this week, one of the sites, one of the programs is they're moving more now to a virtual program. And so sort of their brick and mortar sites, they're not as big as they used to be. We used to have like 50 sites around the country. So I did a lot of the training for the brick and mortar sites. And because of COVID, I didn't really want to do a virtual kind of program. So I've kind of stepped back a little bit now and I'm working more just, promoting the book and teaching my 200-hour training and doing some, teaching in other programs. So I feel like I'm stepping away from it a little more as it's gone more to a virtual format.
Sure. Well, let's talk about your book, The Centered Heart, which is newly out, right? When did it come out?
It came out in May, so it's just 6 months or so, yeah.
Yeah. So I've got a little blurb here I'm going to read to our listeners from your book. And you write, we're all living somewhere in the space between ease and dis-ease. And the choices we make each day about how we live can move us closer to one end or the other on that continuum of health. And stress itself is an epidemic of monumental proportions. And the way that we react and respond to stressful situations plays a major role in our suffering. The CDC notes that 75 to 90% of all doctors' office visits are for stress-related ailments and complaints. Additionally, the medical establishment has long confirmed the link between stress and heart disease, which is the number one cause of death, with approximately one person dying every 36 seconds in the United States from cardiovascular disease. That's 1 in every 4 deaths. And we never think it will be us who will be affected. We make excuses and pretend everything is fine. And so I read that and I thought, oh my gosh, this is so true and so astonishing at the same time. And, I imagine that stress has had an even bigger impact on our health since the early days of the Dean Ornish program, when it was first identified that we need to do something about stress then. And fortunately, the practices of yoga are there to help. So I'd love if you could just kind of share from the book some of the premises and guidelines that can help us steer back toward ease, away from the dis-ease, away from those choices that can lead to dis-ease.
Thank you. Well, each chapter of the book is really dedicated to one specific practice or an intervention. But when they're done all together, they really form this powerful healing path. And the interventions, the chapters in the book, are really, all inspired from yoga. And so the first, gentle movements or postures, and then breathing, relaxation, meditation, and imagery. Those are all the components of the Dean Ornish program. But when I wrote the book, I added 2 other components. And these are also, this one, compassion, is also part of the Dean Ornish program, but it's not been part of the stress management. And I think it very much is part of stress management. So that became another practice and another chapter in the book. And then the last one was our connection to nature. And I really felt like that was really inspired by my years of study and training in Ayurveda and Ayurvedic medicine. It's really the sister science to yoga, and this understanding that everything in nature that exists outside of us also exists inside of us, and that how we interface with nature really affects our health and our well-being. And actually in Ayurveda, they say the first step in the disease process is a break from nature. It's our forgetting that we're part of something bigger. So I really wanted to put that in because I felt like that was really important. But all of these practices woven together, each one is a standalone practice. I mean, each one has research and tremendous outcomes if you just practice one of these. But when you do them all together, it's really incredible. And they can really help change the way we react and respond to stress. And they also really help to just rewire the nervous system and build this sort of nervous system resilience.
Yeah, it's so beautiful. And I noticed by looking through your book that the movement practices, you've got chair yoga practices that are really accessible for all folks. And when we think about working with individuals who have cardiovascular disease, we want to make the yoga practices really accessible.
Yeah, and I think that's what's different about this particular practice is the yoga postures aren't really used for exercise. And a lot of our participants used to come to our program, they would think that they were going to come to an exercise class. And we had exercise was part of the lifestyle intervention in the Ornish program, and it was separate. So if they were doing like an Ashtanga yoga practice, we'd say, well, count that as your exercise, because really the movements in this practice are really about bringing yourself into the experience of your own body so that you can listen. That's another thing. Ayurveda says disease knocks 3 times, and if we don't listen, it takes us. And I really feel like these movements are a listening practice. And in that way, they're very different than doing movements in a sort of Simon Says kind of way. And a lot of yoga for many years, especially in the 90s and in the early 2000s, was really just a more of an exercise practice. And so this is really shifting what we might have thought those, doing postures were all about. It's really saying, hey, do these and then listen. There was a really cool thing that we had invited Yogi Desai to Nebraska, to Omaha, to teach for us. And one of the things he said that really stuck with me is he said, doing postures without pausing in between, without relaxing, is like planting a garden and then leaving town when the crops come in. And I thought, yeah, that's right.
What
That's
a
exactly
great
right.
saying. Yeah.
Yeah. So that stuck with me. And I thought, yeah, we really need to do our practice in a way that helps us listen and drop in and integrate. So that's why doing chair yoga, even if you can do some of the bigger movements, I always say to students when I teach, it's like these small movements have a profound effect on the way they move energy in the body. And often, if we move quickly or we do big movements, we lose that sort of subtle energy response. We don't get to check in with that. We don't move energy in the same way. So I really, feel like changing that relationship we have to movement and doing postures in a chair or doing it in a very simple way can be incredibly profound and healing.
Yeah, I could not agree more. Even for myself, as I'm aging and slowing it down to pay attention just brings it to such a different level. And so I agree wholeheartedly, and I love the way that you said that, and I hope it resonates with our listeners too, and I imagine it will. As you mentioned earlier, there's also an entire chapter in the book dedicated to compassion. And I know there's a lot of research right now talking about self-compassion and how beneficial it is for our mental health. But I'd love if you could speak to how compassion is a key component to reducing stress.
Okay, well, it isn't something that we would normally think of as a stress management technique, compassion, but compassion is actually something that we need to practice. It's not something a lot of times that comes naturally. And the word compassion actually means to suffer with, unlike sympathy, where we separate ourselves, where we almost feel allergic to the other person. We don't want to get what they have, so we feel sympathy for them. But when we feel compassion, we're joining with someone in their experience of suffering. And that brings us closer to them, and it brings us into sort of communion with them or into community. And when we see people around us as part of our community, or part of us even, that we all are together in this, it's much more difficult to feel those emotions of anger and separation and to lash out. So a perfect example, I have this really good friend, and years ago we used to drive around together and go thrift shopping, and I would get so angry if people would cut us off in traffic, and I would start like cursing, and he finally looked at me and he said, Susie, like, what if that person is like rushing to the hospital to see their child? Or what if their grandmother just passed away? And I thought, oh my God, what a different way to look at it. And as soon as I did that, as soon as I started sort of giving people the benefit of the doubt or just shifting my perception just a little bit to have some compassion, to think about what they are living, what their life might be like today, I became such a different driver. And it's the same thing that we do that's happening in the world right now. We've done this whole us and them. We've done it in politics. We've done a really good job of it. I think the media has helped us do a really good job of saying we're different than them and they're different than us. And therefore we can be angry because they're not thinking the way we are, rather than sort of looking at, well, all of us kind of want the same things. We might be using different language for it, but in some ways, we all want our kids to be happy. We all want to live in a clean environment. We all want, there's certain things that we all want. We all want to have good jobs and be able to afford our food. And so when you look at it that way, you can have more understanding for others and you don't sort of inflame yourself. You don't come at everybody with your fists up, but you can actually sort of put your fists down and let your heart open and soften. And when we do that, when we choose that over anger or, this kind of like, I don't understand them, that kind of stance that we have, it saves our nervous system, it saves our hearts, and it actually redirects this sort of energy, that sort of angry energy, into a softer, more compassionate stance. And we're able to sort of move through our lives with a little more ease and grace.
I understand what you're saying. And it's up to us to practice, right? And I think even just the simple example that you used about driving is a place to start, right? And what your friend offered as a suggestion.
Yeah, I know. It changed my life. And now I try to even use it, when I'm on any kind of social media and something comes through and I'm really enraged, I think, well, I wonder what is going on with this person. Instead of like, I sort of shift my perspective to look at it differently. And I've had a couple of those things happen recently where there's been something that's been posted. And I think, well, I wonder what's going on with them and what's happening in their life and what's brought them to this place that they would be thinking and feeling this way.
Yeah, even in
Yeah.
your book, I remember just reading, I think in the very beginning, you gave a scenario one and a scenario two of how you could start your day, right? You could start
Mhm.
your day getting up and rushing and not taking the time and going to a meeting and feeling kind of defeated, or you could start your day from a different approach with some quiet, some meditation, feeling in. And those difference in scenarios are just so obvious, right? That we do have control over
Mhm.
our own inner landscape and our own inner peace. There's so much in the world that can get us upset and angry. And
Yeah.
taking the time to come from that perspective can be so helpful for us, for our own hearts, right? Our own levels of stress, our own nervous systems.
Yeah, I think that there's a sutra in the yoga. I mean, the sutra, everybody knows it. It's called Pratipakshabhavana. And it's this ability to take a situation that's negative and shift it. And it doesn't mean that we don't experience negativity and we don't let ourselves experience anger or depression or whatever it is that we're feeling, because it's good to feel our feelings. But Pratipakshabhavana is sort of directing us to feel our feelings and then make a conscious choice on how we want to look at that so that we don't disturb our own inner peace. And I love that. I think there's a difference between that and sort of spiritual bypass, where we just move past our feelings and always choose to look at something positively, that sort of toxic positivity. I think this is different. I think what the sutras are saying here is yes, you can't, you have to assess your feelings and then just make a decision, a conscious choice that you want to create a different outcome instead of always going down the same path, of negativity. You could shift it and then you might have a different outcome. And I love that. And I have to remind myself all the time. In fact, my family, my family is just great that way because, if I'm somebody who I'm very, I'm a Vata constitution, which means I have a lot of wind element. And I often lose my keys and I forget things and I have to go back home. And that's sort of my nature. And sometimes I can get in a fit about it. I can get really upset. And my family will always say, they have a couple things they'll say, I know somebody who wrote a book about this. And then I'll start laughing. Or they'll say, nanny cam. Like, if you were on the nanny cam, would you want everybody to see you acting like this? Like, use some of your skills here. And so it's always great to be reminded, not in a way where just not very heartfelt, but by them who, it makes me laugh and then I can shift. But we all go through it every day. We always have an opportunity to shift how we want to respond to something. And sometimes we just don't. Sometimes we just need to go down that rabbit hole and just see where it takes us. And when we let ourselves be angry and we don't have compassion and we don't have understanding for anyone around us, for ourselves, and then we see the outcome and we're like, oh, well, that wasn't a great choice. So I think we have to constantly be willing to be schooled by our experience and go, oh, okay, well, that didn't feel so great. Or I don't like myself when I act that way. So I think I'm going to choose that very often. And that's one of the things that, I talk about in the book is, and I talk about it all the time, and you probably do too, Michelle, in all your trainings, is about this strengthening the buddhi or this wise mind or this ability to observe and step back. I think that discernment is what's getting us into trouble right now. Nobody can kind of feel their way into discerning what the right thing is to do or say in this moment because we've sort of been, we've got all these things that say, this is the truth. No, this is the truth. And I think that we really have to be able to look inward and find what the truth is for us and our own discernment. And I think that that helps us with all of these choices that we're making.
Well, I'd love if you could maybe give us a little practice from the book even that could help guide us as humans in this stressful time back to our hearts. Would you be up for that?
I would absolutely be up for that. How much time do we have, Michelle? Do we have like 5 or 10 minutes?
Sure.
Okay. Well, I'll try to make it a little brief practice, but there's this one practice that I love. I don't know if I had included it in the book, but it's a practice that I really love. And it's just a practice of checking in with your heart. And so I'm going to invite whoever is listening, if they want to do this, you can sit in a chair to do it, or you could lie down, however you feel most comfortable. So I'm going to just invite everyone to take a minute and get comfortable. Once you find a position, either sitting or lying down, take several conscious, slow, deep breaths. And just begin to sink and settle every time you exhale. It's almost as if you could feel your bones sighing when you exhale. This kind of deep, sort of earthy letting go. And just begin to make that shift from thinking and doing to feeling and being. Begin to gather yourself in the spaces of your own body, as if you could feel yourself taking up residence in your own body with a little more presence, a little more awareness. And you might even start by breathing from your bones to your skin, as if your whole body were breathing. As if you could feel your whole body expanding as you inhale and contracting as you exhale. And begin to now sense and feel your own heart. Sometimes it's helpful to even put your hands over your heart, or just to feel like you're dropping into the spaces of your own heart. And you could breathe now as if your own heart were breathing in, as if your own heart were breathing out. And just recognizing that your own heart is the center of your own intuition. It's the seat of your own inner wisdom, your own inner healer. And you can begin to ask your own heart what it needs for healing. Is there something that you could be doing? Is there something that you're missing, that you're not paying attention to, that you need to pay attention to? And you can ask your heart this almost like reciting a mantra, but you can ask it with this sense of humility and reverence, like you were approaching a great wise teacher or a really trusted friend. What is it that I need for healing? Is there something that I could be doing? Something that I could be paying attention to that would support me in my own health and well-being? And just asking it over and over again with that sense of humility and reverence, openness. And also listening with that same kind of openness and willingness, asking and listening. And it's just this process of asking and listening that brings you into a relationship with your own intuition, your own heart, your own inner wisdom. And it may be that the heart answers. Sometimes the heart speaks in words, sometimes images, sometimes this kind of aha knowingness. And sometimes it doesn't speak at all. But you might later on have an aha moment, or you may later on find yourself in the right place at the right time, with the right people in the right circumstances, where life seems to flow with this kind of grace and ease. This happens when we're in tune with our own intuition, with our own inner wisdom. Life has more of a flow. So taking just a moment more to ask and listen, this kind of gentle awareness, openness, reverence, and humility. And before you close the practice, send a wave of gratitude to your own heart, your own precious heart, for all of the ways that it supports you, for all of those gems of wisdom that it provides. A wave of gratitude for this precious life, this precious birth. And knowing that you can return to this practice, you can return to your own inner wisdom, your own precious heart at any time. And so when you feel ready, let yourself transition back, feeling yourself in the spaces of the room. Thank you. Thanks for letting me lead that practice, Michelle.
Yeah, it was really beautiful. I almost feel like we could end the episode here, but I have one last question for you if you're up for it.
Of course.
Great. Well, I'd love to know about your own personal practices. What helps Susie on a day-to-day basis? We put so much emphasis on personal practice and sadhana in our training programs for those who want to be yoga therapists, for those who want to do this work with others in the world. First, you have to tend to your own practice. And I'm sure you live by that too. And everyone's practice is also unique. So what do your daily practices look like these days?
Yeah, I love that you say these days because, it's been 40 some years and they change. When we're younger, they're different. And when we're older, they're different. And, I change my practice to sort of accommodate the seasons. So, like right now, we're in wind season. So a lot of my posture practice is really about grounding and strengthening and stabilizing. So I do a lot of, in this time, I do a lot of standing, steadying practices. And I do a lot of simple, like I try to keep it really simple so that I don't struggle to do my practice. I want to like enjoy it. So I try to stay away from those sort of harsh rules around practice. It took me a long time to sort of let up on myself. I meditate every morning and I do a little posture practice and I do a breathing practice about 15 minutes. I usually, right now I'm using Brahmari and Ujjayi alternate nostril breathing and Sitali. So it takes me about 20 minutes. I do about 5 minutes of each. And then, what I love to do is in the afternoons, it doesn't happen every afternoon, but a lot of afternoons I do a yoga nidra practice. And it really just helps me to kind of move into the evening with a little more grace, a little more energy, a little more focus. So I love that time. My husband and I often do it together. We'll be like, let's do our yoga nidra. So it's really a great time. And then another thing that I do is I walk every day in nature. That's a really important practice for me. And I spend at least an hour a day and sometimes longer walking outside, just admiring nature and just being in. We walked in the rain yesterday and it was just really lovely, cold and rainy and damp. And I usually hate that weather, but when I'm doing it as sort of my way to connect to nature, I just love it. But, I think the most important practice that I do is the practice of letting my yoga inform my life. Because I think without that, I think if we just have this practice and it doesn't really seep into our lives, it's not doing anything. So I'm always trying to sort of bring what I'm learning on the mat into how I'm treating others, how I treat myself, how I live my life. I always am looking to letting that practice inform my experience off the mat.
So beautiful. And I love many of the things that you incorporate and do them myself on a daily basis too. It really makes such a difference. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing with us today. And I'll provide some links so that people can learn more about you. I'll provide those in the show notes. Folks can find the book, which is called The Centered Heart. And I hope to stay in touch. I know we will.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michelle. And I just want to thank you for all the work that you're doing in the yoga community to bring these practices to others and to share and to just keep the tradition going. I feel like there's not enough people thanking teachers like you and the work that you're doing. So thank you so much.
My pleasure.
If you'd like to learn more about who we are and what we do, visit us at innerpeaceyogatherapy.com.